our Infinity War episode. Thanks for coming around for the second helping here, and we're just going to jump right back into the conversation that Aaron Welty and Rob Goudie and I had about Avengers Infinity War. So I just want to mention something that sort of cracked me up and that I couldn't stop seeing the second time I went through the movie. When they're at the sanctum and Tony sort of senses like these weird vibrations and he looks over at Strange and he says, "Doc, you're not moving your hair, are you?" And Strange says, "Not at this moment." And like, to me, that implies like, oh, sometimes he does make his hair move for dramatic effect. And so like throughout the whole rest of the movie, like every time there should not be any wind going on and Strange's hair moves, like I noticed it. I was like, oh, is he making it move now?
John, do you think that part of it might just be like a visual comedic gag, but do you think character-wise part of that is some of the vanity of his former life still sticking with him?
It's possible. Honestly, I didn't think that much into it, and just was thinking like, they've got wind machines going on all the time, whether it makes sense or not, because like the character's hair should just kind of be like lightly billowing, especially the girl's hair, and so on. So anyway, it was just kind of a funny thing that I couldn't stop seeing once like I made that connection in my head when he says "not at this moment." Like, yeah, the implication being sometimes he does, and apparently, it was going on later.
So sometimes you just got to style your hair by telekinesis. Were there things that you guys found that you would be critical of in the movie that you didn't like or that you wish had been there? I mean, I kind of mentioned my thing about just, really we get the death of Loki at the beginning and then a lot of nothing until the very end. Or Gamora and then the end. But was there any other...
Yeah, there's definitely a couple of things that I thought of later. So in terms of at least like Earth, Thanos' plan of wiping out half of life seems to me to be kind of short-sighted, because like the like fundamental characteristic of life is to make more life. And even if you wipe out half the universe, like at some point you're going to have to do it again. Like you haven't actually solved anything.
Mm-hmm.
And like, especially in terms of Earth, like Earth's population was at 3.5 billion, like just in 1960. Like we're only 50 years away, like from being, even if half the population was wiped out, and obviously it would, there would be huge, upheaval and it's not like people would just continue to, repopulate at the same rate necessarily. But yeah, wiping out half the life in the universe, it's a stopgap measure. You haven't actually solved anything in any sort of like meaningful and lasting way. And so
I also wonder how he got to 50%. Yeah, 50% should do it. That sounds good. The same for everybody.
Yeah. It's a very tidy mathematical thing. It's a coin flip. So, you either are going to die or you don't.
But I would say that the one of the major ways in which I think the movie fell short, and I think the reality is filming schedules and things that they couldn't predict. But when you watch this movie, having recently watched Black Panther and having both of these movies in theaters at the same time right now, one of the things you realize is there's not nearly as much of Black Panther or Wakanda in this movie as you would have expected. But I think that goes back to the fact that they didn't quite anticipate Black Panther being as successful as a standalone film as it actually ended up being.
Well, and also you have to think about the kind of story that you're actually telling in this movie. Like, this is the big crossover event. This is not the place where you get to do the big, character investigations and really like diving into what makes these guys tick. Like, this is where like you've done all of that work before, and like you've laid all of that structure, and so now you get to blow it up in a really spectacular fashion.
Well, I also wonder if they had known that Black Panther was going to be as successful as it was, would they have made the choice to have T'Challa die as part of the snap?
I mean, I think that was there was always going to be a Black Panther 2, probably. I mean, that is another thing that's a little bit of a weakness in this film, is that that the stakes are actually not quite as high as the movie would like for you to believe, because there's a sequel to Spider-Man: Homecoming on the slate. There's a Black Panther 2 on the slate. That, let's see, who else goes that is gonna, like, there's a Guardians 3 coming out.
Right. So Gamora.
So, like, well, and maybe not Gamora, but certainly not all of the Guardians except Rocket. Like,
right.
Yeah.
Well, and that's a conversation I've had with some other folks about this movie is, do you come away at least a little bit from watching this feeling like emotionally manipulated because of the fact that so many of these stakes that they try to get you to believe are so high are in fact not?
Yeah, I've heard that criticism just about, like, people saying that they didn't feel like there were stakes in the movie. And I mean, part of that is just because of the environment that we're in now, where we know everything about the next movies that are coming up, right, and all of that stuff. It's a little bit unfortunate, but at the same time, I mean, it's not like we don't have a very, very long and storied history of comic books killing people and bringing them back.
Yeah, and particularly in the source material of this film, like,
yes,
that's sort of the main resolution of that whole deal, is that Nebula gains the gauntlet and wishes everything back as it was 24 hours ago. So literally, nobody dies in the comic book version, except probably for, like, that woman that Thanos made to be his mate after he decided that death wasn't ever going to cut it for him.
Taraxia the Terrible?
Yeah.
So I'll fight fire with fire on that one and just say, we know that a bunch of these heroes are coming up to the end of their contracts.
Yes.
And the drama for me is not necessarily, all of these people who died in the snap. It's actually the people who didn't. Yeah. And if you notice, it's all the original Avengers.
It is.
Yep.
I did notice that. Yep.
And,
absolutely.
I'm thinking to myself, yes, everything's going to be restored, but what is it going to cost those people who are left to do it?
Absolutely. That is 100%. That's word for word like what I wrote in my piece about
yes,
about this thing. It's
it's my idea.
In the end, I'm not as interested in who's going to stay dead and who's going to come back. What I'm more interested in, and where the stakes actually lie, is in what will it cost. We know what it cost for Thanos to have his victory. What is it going to cost for the heroes to have their victory? And this is another sort of criticism that I have about the logic of this story and the way that the characters move through the story, is that there are a lot of choices that get made in this movie by characters who have to decide who will live and who will die. And time after time you get this choice that's made in the favor of the one or the few over the many. And even when characters seem willing to make the more difficult choice and sacrifice the one or the few for the good of the many, that gets turned on its head. And for me, I can't help but wonder if it might not have been a more interesting story to allow some of those more complicated choices to get made in the less obviously heroic, fashion. If we, see, for instance, and I just sort of mentioned these in my piece a little bit. Gamora is a being of sufficiently complex morality that, even though watching Thanos torture Nebula is very, very painful for her, it must be obvious that it pales in comparison to the suffering that's going to be felt by the entire universe if he succeeds.
Yes.
And with Vision, this decision to try and separate the stone from him without unduly harming him, that is a choice that already, puts, like, you're still trying to save the universe, but in doing it, like, you're putting it at greater risk because we're not willing to let this person make the sacrifice that they're willing to make. And so I wonder if there isn't sort of a more nuanced, complicated, difficult, interesting version of this story where sacrifices are allowed to be made, and then the heroes have to deal with what that means for them relationally and emotionally moving forward.
Yeah, and also that the sacrifice gets made and doesn't necessarily solve the problem.
Yeah, definitely. Right, because this movie always has to end with the snap or some version thereof. Otherwise you don't really get the full effect of the story that's being told. It would have been a cheat if this was just one movie and they won at the end.
Absolutely. And I think the only characters that are complex enough in a way that would have been able to make those sort of complex decisions were Gamora and Strange. But even with Gamora, she ends up, telling Thanos where it is as she's watching Nebula get tortured. So even though there is that complexity, this decision that she makes kind of wipes a lot of that complexity out.
Yeah. Yep. That's definitely an issue that I have. But one of sort of the clever piece of writing that I appreciated is the way that the time stones role in Thanos' acquisition of the Mind Stone is kind of foreshadowed by the way that Vision and Wanda talk repeatedly about having time between themselves. He says, we've been stealing these moments for 3 years. And Wanda says to Romanoff, we just wanted some time. And then towards the end, Vision tells Wanda, we're out of time. And then, obviously, Thanos, uses the time stone to put Vision back together so he can steal the stone.
John, do either of you or Rob, with Vision and Wanda in particular, because there's that whole discussion that pops up a couple of times about Vision saying that Wanda's the only one who really has the capacity to make the choice when it needs to be made. Kind of, in a way, it kind of mirrors the whole conversation between Quill and Gamora, and when the moment comes, neither one of them can make the choice that the other one feels like needs to be made, and a lot of it is because there's that romantic entanglement.